Close your eyes and imagine ancient Rome, the marble palaces, the golden statues, the grand markets buzzing with traders from distant lands. Now, open your eyes, because if you were an ordinary Roman citizen, your daily life was far less glamorous, and far more uncomfortable than you might think. We've all heard about the glory of Rome. History books are full of its mighty emperors, monumental buildings, and roads that stretch to the edges of the known world. The empire's image is polished, literally, in shining marble, with rich senators reclining at banquets and noble generals riding home in triumph. But if you weren't born into wealth, your Rome was different. Instead of waking up in a spacious villa surrounded by olive trees, you likely lived in an insula, a tall, narrow apartment block made mostly of wood and brick. These buildings could stretch up to 6 or 7 stories, connected by narrow staircases. The higher you lived, the cheaper your rent. But also, the greater your risk of disaster. Fires were common, as was the sudden collapse of poorly built walls. And if you think your modern upstairs neighbors are noisy, just imagine a world without soundproofing, where you could hear every clatter of pottery, every crying baby, and every goat bleating in the courtyard. Mornings in Rome didn't start with the soft buzz of an alarm clock or the smell of fresh coffee. Coffee wouldn't be discovered for over 1,000 years. Instead, the day began with the sounds of the city itself. Street vendors shouted their wares, from bread sellers calling out "panis," to fishmongers displaying their slippery catches from the Tiber River. The squeak of cart wheels mixed with the clip-clop of hooves as donkeys and mules pulled loads of grain or firewood through the narrow streets. The first meal of the day was small and simple. Romans called it ientaculum, and it was usually nothing more than a piece of bread, maybe dipped in olive oil or watered wine. If you were lucky, you might have some cheese or dried figs to go with it. For poorer citizens, breakfast could be just a crust of bread from the day before. No sugar, no hot drinks, no rich spreads, just fuel to start the day. Bathing, for the majority, wasn't something done at home. Only the wealthiest Romans could afford private baths. For everyone else, there were the thermae, the public bathhouses. These were impressive complexes, with heated rooms, pools, and exercise yards, but they weren't exactly peaceful retreats. Imagine a crowd of people chatting, arguing, or negotiating business deals while you try to enjoy a soak. The baths were as much about social life as cleanliness, and the water wasn't always as fresh as one might hope. Still, it was a daily ritual for many, a chance to clean off the city dust and hear the latest gossip. Clothing, too, was more practical than luxurious. The famous toga, that sweeping white garment we see in movies, was actually impractical for daily wear. It was large, heavy, and had to be draped in just the right way. One wrong move and the folds could slip apart, leaving you in an embarrassing situation in the middle of the forum. Most citizens, especially those who worked, preferred a simple tunic, a loose-fitting woolen garment belted at the waist. In the summer heat, wool could be itchy, and in the winter, without proper layers, it was far from warm. Shoes were simple leather sandals, which meant feet were dusty in summer and cold in winter. Socks were rare, though some people did improvise with strips of cloth wrapped around their feet. Then there was the smell of Rome, something rarely shown in films or paintings. The city's population numbered in the hundreds of thousands, and with so many people, and animals, packed together, odors were inevitable. While Rome did have an advanced sewer system for its time, the famous cloaca maxima, waste management was still basic. Streets could be littered with refuse, and chamber pots were sometimes emptied out of windows. Add to that the strong aroma of garum, a fermented fish sauce beloved by Romans, and the air was a constant blend of cooking smoke, livestock, and human activity. Garum was poured over meats, vegetables, and even some fruits, and while Romans adored it, newcomers often found its pungent scent overwhelming. Still, amid these less-than-glamorous realities, there was a vibrant energy to the city. The streets were alive with traders selling goods from across the empire, spices from the east, wool from Britannia, glassware from Egypt. Musicians played in the markets, children darted between stalls, and shopkeepers haggled with customers over prices. Despite the cramped housing, the smells, and the lack of modern comforts, there was a sense of belonging, of being part of something vast and important. Because being a Roman citizen, even an uncomfortable one, came with pride. You had certain rights, like the ability to vote in assemblies, if you were male, to appeal to a magistrate if accused of a crime, and to take part in public festivals and games. The city might not have been comfortable, but it was alive, a mix of grandeur and grit, luxury and labor, all beating to the rhythm of the eternal city. So while the history books show us polished marble and golden laurel crowns, it's worth remembering that most Romans lived in the shadows of those monuments, navigating the daily challenges of life in a crowded, noisy, endlessly fascinating city. And perhaps, in its own way, that life, uncomfortable though it was, had its own kind of glory. If the mornings of a Roman citizen were noisy, simple, and filled with the bustle of public life, the rest of the day didn't slow down much. Rome was a city that never truly rested, not even in the hottest midday hours. And for the ordinary citizen, every day meant work, whether in the fields, the market, or the workshops tucked into the ground floors of apartment buildings. For those who farmed outside the city, the day began before sunrise. Fields of wheat, barley, olives, and grapes didn't tend themselves. Farming was hard, physical work, often done with tools that hadn't changed much for centuries, wooden plows, handheld sickles, and baskets for carrying crops. In the summer, the sun could be relentless, baking the soil and the farmer alike. In the winter, cold winds swept through the countryside, making early mornings a chilly ordeal. In the city, work took many forms. Blacksmiths hammered at glowing iron, filling the air with the rhythmic clang of metal on metal. Potters shaped clay into jars and cups, their hands stained from the earth. Bakers rose early to heat massive clay ovens, selling loaves to customers who gathered with baskets. Street sellers called out their goods, figs, olives, bread, fish, their voices mixing with the constant rumble of carts over the cobblestones. If you were educated, you might work as a scribe, a teacher, or a clerk. These jobs were cleaner but still demanding. Scribes spent long hours hunched over wax tablets or papyrus scrolls, copying letters or accounts by hand. Teachers wrangled groups of restless children, some of whom would rather be anywhere else than in a classroom. Public officials spent their days in the forum, surrounded by political debates, petitioners, and the hum of gossip. Lunch, or prandium, was usually light, bread, cheese, maybe some beans or cold leftovers from the previous night's dinner. Meat was rare, except for the wealthy or on feast days. Fresh fish was popular, but in a city as large as Rome, fresh could sometimes be a matter of interpretation. Fruit like figs, grapes, and apples provided sweetness when in season. And, of course, garum, the fermented fish sauce, found its way into nearly every dish. Its salty, pungent taste was beloved by Romans, though to modern noses it might have been challenging. Dinner, cena, was the main meal of the day. For the poor, it might be a simple porridge made of barley or wheat, flavored with vegetables or a bit of meat if available. Wealthier citizens could enjoy multi-course meals with roasted meats, exotic fruits, and elaborate desserts. But while the rich dined reclining on couches, the average Roman ate sitting on a stool or standing, often in a small, dim room lit by oil lamps. Plates were wooden, cups were clay, and napkins, if used, could be just a piece of bread. Entertainment was one area where Rome excelled, at least in spectacle. Public games, festivals, and performances were frequent and usually free for citizens. The Colosseum offered gladiator fights, animal hunts, and dramatic reenactments of famous battles. The Circus Maximus hosted chariot races that drew massive crowds. But comfort wasn't part of the package. Seating was stone, shade was scarce, and the air could be thick with dust, sweat, and the smell of street food cooking nearby. And if you were unlucky, you might find yourself sitting next to an overly enthusiastic fan who shouted in your ear for the entire event. As evening approached, the streets didn't grow much quieter. Market stalls packed away their goods, but taverns filled with customers, musicians played in courtyards, and neighbors lingered to chat in doorways. Rome's population meant there was always noise, the bleating of goats, the shouting of children, the distant clanging from a blacksmith's forge. When darkness fell, the city took on a different mood. Street lighting was minimal, a few oil lamps here and there, which left most alleys in shadow. Walking home after dark could be risky. Thieves were a known problem, and without an organized police force, safety depended on luck or traveling in groups. Wealthier citizens often had slaves or guards accompany them, while others simply tried to get home before sunset. Inside the insula, the night brought its own discomforts. Rooms were small and shared by multiple family members, sometimes with animals kept indoors for safety. Beds were wooden frames topped with straw-filled mattresses, which could be lumpy and scratchy. Blankets were wool, which was warm but could also be rough against the skin. In summer, the rooms trapped the day's heat, making it hard to sleep. In winter, cold drafts crept through the walls and under the doors. Privacy was rare. With thin walls and no insulation, you could hear your neighbors' conversations, their children crying, even the clink of their dinner bowls. In a way, it created a sense of community. You knew your neighbors' lives almost as well as your own, but it also meant there was no real escape from the noise of others. Still, for all the discomfort, Roman citizens took pride in their way of life. Festivals brought bursts of joy and color to the year, parades with music, costumes, and free food distributed to the crowd. Religious ceremonies connected people to the gods and to their shared traditions. And the markets offered a taste of the wider world, with goods from distant provinces and stories from travelers who had seen the edges of the empire. Life in Rome was a mix of grandeur and grit. You could walk past towering marble temples on your way to buy bread from a wooden stall. You could hear the roar of the crowd in the Colosseum and then return home to a cramped apartment. You could live surrounded by history and power, yet still struggle with leaky roofs, noisy streets, and the occasional rat in the pantry. So, when you imagine Rome, don't just think of emperors in shining armor or senators in pristine togas. Think also of the cobblestone streets worn smooth by countless footsteps, the smoky glow of oil lamps at night, the warm bread fresh from the baker's oven, and the quiet pride of a people who called themselves citizens of the eternal city, even if their beds were lumpy and their lives, at times, surprisingly uncomfortable.